This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Good afternoon or good evening, all, and welcome back to regular listeners of Teacher Talk Radio. We are welcoming you tonight to our new show on Sunday the 3rd of November, which promises to be a great one. Let's lessen those Sunday stresses, end of half-term blues, and delve into tonight's show. Clear the path, fewer admin tasks, better teacher-student connections.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Well, good evening all from the slightly cooler, finally, Abu Dhabi for tonight's Teachers Talk Radio show, entitled Clear the Path, Fewer Admin Tasks, Better Teacher-Student Connections. I'm your host, of course, Sarah Kate Tolson, and I'm really delighted that you're joining us as we dive into one of the most probably pressing conversations, I think, in education today. How can we reduce administrative burdens to foster stronger teacher-student relationships and, of course, enhance learning outcomes for our young people? Let's face it, teaching has never been and probably never will be a 9 to 5. It's not a light workload, and as we go into the profession, I think we're all very aware of that. Well, at least it hasn't been a light workload for me, particularly from personal experience over the past 14 years in the trade. Recent data from the UK's Department for Education shows that teacher welfare is under unprecedented strain. And the reports highlight that over 50% now of educators cite unmanageable workload as the primary reason for considering leaving the profession. This burden isn't just paperwork, though. It's a roadblock that stands between teachers and their students, impacting the quality of interactions that lie at the heart of effective teaching. In addition, of course, we have findings from recent educational studies revealing that teachers are not just grappling with workload pressures, they're managing increasingly diverse student needs. The intersection of inclusion and support for our students requires a huge amount of dedication and time, effective training, upskilling of staff from a leadership perspective, and 100% focus. Something that excessive admin tasks can often drain away. The result? Teacher burnout. The rates of teacher burnout are spiking, with retention numbers continuing to falter. Tonight, we'll try to unpack these challenges with insights from, very excited to introduce in a moment, my experienced and wonderful guests, former head teacher Catherine Gorman, and an inclusion specialist who I had the pleasure of meeting very recently, actually, at a local conference out here in the UAE, Emmanuel Aweyelu. I hope I got his surname right, because I did practice earlier. I'm sorry, Manny, if I didn't. Our guests today are joining us in their free time, which we all do as teachers. And every time I attend any conference or deliver any CPD, it always amazes me that we are one of the only professions, I think, that I can think of that will willingly give up our time to improve our own professional development, as well as improving the outcomes of our students. They are here on their Sunday evenings, and they're going to share their perspectives and experiences on how to shift from draining admin to impactful practice that nurture better teacher-student outcomes. So please stay tuned. Welcome again to all of our guests. And please remember that this is a live show. And although you can listen back on demand through Podbean on Teachers Talk Radio, we welcome you to join in live on the conversation tonight or this afternoon, depending on where you are in the world, and to really share your experiences, offer some top tips. We're all in this together, and of course pose some questions to our special guests on the show tonight. You can also call in live via the Podbean app on your phone, which we would love to speak to some of our colleagues and educators out there tonight on this really pressing conversation that we're going to be dealing with. So stay tuned, grab a cuppa, and let's dive in. Exploring these strategies that could not only help us as teachers and educators stay happily and healthily in the profession, but also thrive in it. And let's clear the path together for meaningful change. We're going to take a short break for our friends and sponsors of Teachers Talk Radio for some adverts, but please stay tuned as I welcome my two amazing special guests next.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at Bet UK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at Bet UK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
Thank you so much to our friends and sponsors there. Always some great discount codes up for grabs as well, so keep tuned for the news and further advert breaks as well. Okay, so without further ado then, I'm going to introduce my special guest tonight on the show, and I'm going to unmute them so I don't forget in a moment when I start asking some questions. Okay, so first and foremost, we have, in no particular order, of course, we have Catherine Gorman. Now, Catherine has a very impressive CV, and I'm probably going to miss something off. So, Catherine, please do correct me or add if I do. But Catherine, we have here, and I am delighted. She has so much experience in the trade and so much expertise to offer tonight. So we've got 25 years, which makes my mere 14 look pathetic. 25 years of experience in teaching in the UK and internationally, and we're going to hopefully talk a little bit about her international experience in Japan, I believe, a little bit later on. She is a former senior leader and head teacher in an all-through non-selective school, particularly during the pandemic, which again I think is going to be a great topic of conversation later. For Catherine, her educational philosophies are very much based around value-led leadership, and she thrives on amplifying others' potential, which I love. She also believes in more distributed, more collaborative and less hierarchical model of leadership and learning, and is a huge advocate of inclusive education, having worked in some of the most deprived areas of Yorkshire and London in maintained sectors. She has led lots of change, both in curriculum and across her leadership positions, including pupil voice and pupil choice as well in her roles in leadership. And she is now taking a very different, I'd say different, but I'm sure you can make lots of connections, Catherine, between this, but very exciting move to become a founder and director of her own educational consultancy now, which she has formed to support educational leaders to gain clarity and to help call for change amongst what we could call educational crisis at the moment. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's lovely to be here, and lovely to be here with Manny as well. Thank you very much for having me.
You're very welcome, and thank you. This is Catherine's final few hours of half term with her family, relaxing. So again, huge thank you for joining us tonight on the show. And secondly, then we have Manny Emmanuel, but also known to his friends and colleagues as Manny. And as I explained earlier, Manny, I didn't do a very good explanation of it, but Manny I had the pleasure of meeting very briefly, actually, at a local teaching conference on a Friday afternoon. We'd all finished school. I travelled up to Dubai, and he was teaching. One of the guests, not teaching. He was presenting at the event, but also teaching. I learned a lot from him, and his passion and his enthusiasm and experience just shone through. And I think, Manny, you had did we have a 12-minute slot? I think we were given. It
Yeah,
was
yeah, something like
it
that.
was very short and sweet, but in that time he has the wow factor, and I can imagine it has the same impact on his students as well and colleagues. And I just thought I need to have him on this show. We need to delve into his expertise. So Manny has over 10 years experience amongst, I'm sure he will explain much better than what I'm about to do, but such a vast array of different positions in schools. Learning support assistant, teacher, governor, and senior leader in special educational needs. He's currently working as an inclusion specialist teacher in the Middle East. He's had experience, just like Catherine, in public and private sector as well, so it'll be interesting to talk about the differences there. Manny is massively committed to fostering inclusive learning environments, and as I say, that shone through in the mere 12 minutes that I experienced of him delivering his session recently. He has made significant impacts on students' lives across this region, and I know in the UK as well, firmly believing that every child matters and deserves the opportunity to thrive in a supportive and welcoming classroom, which I absolutely love. So welcome to the show, Manny. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the introduction, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Perfect. Amazing. Thank you again to both of our guests. Okay, so we're going to delve straight in then to impact of admin workload. Now, as I thought of this session, there's quite a lot going on with the title, and it was funny actually in the technical meeting that we had just before the session, Catherine asked a really relevant question, which was, what admin tasks are we talking about here, and how are we defining administrative tasks as teachers? And I actually want, if that's okay, Catherine, to start with that, because I think that's a really good starting point for our listeners and for our educators out there. So as we all do, I had a quick chat to GPT. Of course, any other AI websites are available. And I asked it, what are the administrative tasks? Because it's very difficult, I think, as teachers, we just kind of get used to it. We just take it as part and parcel of our daily role. And of course, a lot of it is our job specification. But it came out with a really interesting, very long, as you can imagine, list of admin tasks that teachers will be expected to do or will find themselves doing on a daily basis that could take them away from the teaching and learning inside their classroom. Amongst some of those, I'm not going to read the whole list to you, but amongst some of those, we've got lesson planning, we've got marking, of course, we've got communication with peers, with parents, stakeholders, and with students. We've got meetings. Now, that was quite generic. We've got classroom displays, resources. We've got EHCPs and student needs to individualise and personalise our plans for. School events, extracurricular, supervision, photocopying, which I love because I mean, if I added up the hours that I spend photocopying a week, my goodness me. CPD and cover for absence, amongst a few. That is merely touching the surface of the list that it came up with. So my first question then to my wonderful special guest is, what administrative tasks then are our teachers and educators facing in schools at the moment, and how could we go about reducing this to positively influence teacher morale and student engagement?
Catherine, do you want to go first? Or
Thank you, Manny. So I think for me, I was debating this a lot in the week in my head, and that is what led me, Sarah, as you say, to ask you that question when we came on, because I suppose where I got to my thinking was, is the issue the administration itself, which is actually quite a big word, as you've just demonstrated, or is it, and this might sound a little bit complicated, the administration of the admin, which becomes frustrating. So we know, for example, that as teachers we are required to plan lessons. Now, I personally have never liked, sort of downloading, for example, a pre-prepared scheme of work and delivering that. I would much rather prepare my own lessons. I find it quite difficult to deliver something that I haven't actually created myself, but that is incredibly time-consuming to do. But if there are some techniques or some, opportunities to, perhaps share the preparation of that with my colleagues and to develop a scheme of work alongside my colleagues so that I'm not carrying the total burden of that, then that helps somewhat. For example, you mentioned that when I taught in Japan, that is a methodology that is used there. So lessons are prepared by a teacher and then through a process that's called Kenkyo Jugyo, so lesson study, they peer watch, refine and then develop the lessons so that they become more effective as time goes by. So it builds confidence in that lesson. So that's quite a kind of collaborative and a mutually supportive way of doing things. Some of those other tasks that you mentioned there, I think there are ways perhaps within schools of outsourcing those. Yes, absolutely, photocopying. What teacher does not spend hours and hours next to a photocopier? But of course, there are ways of using support within the school to facilitate tasks like that. But inevitably, sometimes there's always that last minute dash to the photocopier, isn't it? When you remember that you've got something that you need to do. So I think things like that can, of course, catch us out. But for me, it's about the value of the task that we're being asked to do at the end of the day. So if I'm being asked to drop some data every half term or more frequently than that, then the question I would always be asking is why? Why? And not to ask that to be difficult, but just to understand the value and the impact. And for schools, I think they really need to think about then the feedback loop. So if I'm expecting my teachers to prepare their own lessons, to assess with a certain frequency, and then to report that data somewhere with a certain frequency, for what purpose? So I think for me, it comes back to schools being really clear about the purpose of what they're asking their staff to do, and making sure that that feedback loop is really robust. Data sometimes disappears off into a system, and as the person who's generated the data, because you've marked the books or you've completed the assessments, you don't know where it goes or why it goes there. And if you know that because you did that thing, some impact was able to be achieved that then improved outcomes for those students, I think that just makes it feel valuable. And so that might not reduce the amount that you're being asked to do, but at least you understand why you're being asked to do it. So I don't know if that's an okay starting point, Sarah.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I'm just scribbling manically down as you're talking there, Catherine, because there's lots of things that have come out of what you've just said that I want to develop a little bit more, if that's okay. So the first thing that you said, Catherine, is the shared planning. And, this is something from experience, I think, that primary school teachers are very, very good at.
Yes.
Senior school, not as much for whatever reason, and that's not a negative at all. But I know myself as a senior specialist that I am quite picky with what I teach, just like you were saying, Catherine. And, it's all about making it your own, because you've got to feel comfortable teaching it to the group of students in front of you, of course, and that's what we would expect. I'm kind of going to bring Manny in on this a little bit, if that's okay, Manny, with the shared planning. Have you experienced with shared planning any sort of loss of focus or understanding when it comes to inclusion and inclusivity with our students through shared planning, Manny?
Yeah, so Catherine's touched on a few things, and it's such a broad subject. But if we did narrow it down to shared planning, so in my current context, I work in a team. I work in 2 grades, so I oversee grade 3 and grade 4. And in our school, we do have a system where we do shared planning. So there will be multiple meetings throughout the week. I would say at least 3, sometimes 4 meetings in a week, which are designated planning slots. And so I think the question around shared planning is, when you have allocated time to be able to do that, how useful is that time, or how well are you using that time? And I found from experience that time isn't always best used. I think a lot of members of staff sometimes need to be directed and instructed as to what to do specifically. But thinking from a positive point of view, I do find that shared planning and collaborative planning reduces the workload for many of the staff members in my teams. I do also think that because we have designated slots within the week, it allows me as an inclusion specialist teacher to go into those meetings and to really dissect the planning of the teachers, to be able to provide feedback, to discuss resources, to consider different ways in which we can be innovative around the lessons. So I think not only is shared planning a solution, but I think actually giving teachers that dedicated time within the week to be able to do that is also incredibly important. And I will say that in my current context, I work in an international school, and something that we have that I know I never experienced in the UK is we have specialist teachers. So specialist teachers will take on subjects, for instance, like art, innovation is a subject, music, Arabic, Islamic. And so there's actually quite a few gaps, I would say, in the teacher's timetable, the primary teacher's timetable, where they're able to use these slots to meet with the inclusion specialist teacher, to meet with their planning partners for English or for maths, and to then meet as a wider team. So I do think in the context of international schools here, certainly the one that I work in, there are opportunities to tackle the huge amount of admin tasks that we do have to do.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think having that time, like you said, Manny, to actually collaborate is, if you asked teachers, and I'm not going on proven research here, guys, but I would imagine if you asked teachers what they would really like out of time in terms of after school or meeting time, it is to be with their departments or their teams, and it is to share good practice, and it is, of course, the bottom line, to reduce their workload and to make sure that, as you said, Manny, what they're doing with their time is actually impactful. You know, how many of us have had meetings or CPD sessions or directed time that hasn't been so directed, and you know, we've kind of thought, right, well, we've got 1,000,001 jobs to do, where do we start? So I think you're absolutely right in what you're saying. Having that privilege and that time for teachers to actually get together and share the workload and share their expertise is amazing. And I love how you were saying, Manny, that you have the time to then go around as an inclusion specialist and to, you know, to teach teachers what they need, what they're missing, to upskill them on different needs. Because of course, you know, I was reading up before the show tonight, and in the UK alone, I'm focusing on just here, the EHC plans are up by 11.6% just from last academic year. So, you know, inclusion is everybody's responsibility. You know, it's the classic safeguarding card, and it's something that I think personally, from my experience, is kind of seen as a bit of an add-on sometimes in some schools and in some planning, whereas it really needs to be an integral part, as you said, of the planning process of all of our teaching and learning, doesn't it? I'm going to come back to what Catherine was saying about the value of tasks. I think that is absolutely vital. And it's the same for our students, isn't it? You know, you have the students, the reluctant ones, and I'm a languages teacher, so I've been there. I've had all the reluctance in my lessons. Why do we need to learn French? Nobody speaks French, which of course is not true, as we know. But anyway, that's another show. But, you know, getting the students on board is half of the challenge, isn't it? Sometimes with some subjects, depending on, you know, the group of young people in front of you. And I guess it's the same for staff, isn't it? It's showing them the value, showing them the reasons why they're doing the task, and the purposefulness of the task is absolutely key, just like it is to our students when we're expecting them to meet such high expectations in our lessons. So Catherine, how did you in your leadership positions go about communicating this purpose to show your staff that, you know, what they might at first sight deem as a pointless admin task is actually going to impact them and reduce their workload and improve outcomes in the long run?
Thank you, Sarah. So I think if I go back to, and I should start by saying I'm 100% sure I have not always got this right. But if I go back to when I was a deputy head at my previous school, we were very aware. This was just to give the context. It was a highly academic independent girls' school where outcomes in terms of pure examination results were very important. As they are always, but they carried a particular kudos and a particular value in that context. And so we had quite a heavy assessment and reporting agenda across the school. We had a prep section and then the senior section of the school. But we felt that teachers were doing an enormous amount of marking, of assessment, and of reporting, and the question began to be asked: for what purpose? What is this actually making a difference? All of this work that we're doing, and there was a team of us who set about looking at this and thinking about what we should do, and this took a couple of years to implement. But it came down to if reporting, so I'm being quite niche here, but if reporting is supposed to improve the outcomes of the students, then we have to think about who those reports are for. And traditionally, and indeed there is in fact a legal duty, of course, to report to parents, several times a year. But reports are written for parents as the end consumer. And in many schools, that started to shift, and there are some schools with, demonstrating some really innovative practice on this space. But I would certainly encourage people to really think about this, because if you report to parents, it means that you write your reports in a certain way. And it means that you write the feedback in a certain way. And actually, while, yes, the students may get to read the reports just before they go home, it depends on your particular school's culture and policy, they're not being written for those students as such. So we started to shift that. So what we did is we changed the reporting system. We started actually with year 13 because we knew that they would give us the sort of most incisive feedback we felt on this system. And so when we wrote reports, we actually wrote them to the student and we wrote them with the student. So we co-wrote the reports with the students, and time was allowed for this, and it involved the tutor as well. And then when they then had the report, they were expected to comment on it, and then they were expected with their tutor to then review those reports and then set targets. And it was actually those targets that went home. So we were reporting on what we were doing. We were giving parents an update, but the entire exercise was aimed much more specifically at the students rather than a little kind of, summary of what we'd been doing. And gradually over the next few years, we rolled that down through the school, and we trained the staff as we did it so that they developed some sort of fairly basic but quite important coaching skills, and it really became a conversation, and that required resources. So that required that we were able to cover the form tutors' time while they were having those conversations, but strategically this was really important for us to do, and so we allocated our resources. We were fortunate to be able to do so, but we allocated our resources accordingly so that we could do that. And then this became a much bigger piece of work about looking across the school calendar and the academic and reporting calendar, to think very carefully about when we were having those conversations and why, and what else was happening in the school at that time. So in a week when year 13 or year 11 or year 9 or whoever were having those reporting conversations or those tracking, we stopped calling them reporting. For a start, we called them tracking. So we're having those tracking conversations. We made sure that we cleared the decks in those weeks of anything else that those tutors or those heads of departments were expected to do in the school. So no big events in those weeks. Nothing that took that cohort out of school, or got in the way of those conversations, because those conversations, those relational conversations, were really, really important. So if you like, we took the admin of that reporting process. We didn't get rid of it. If anything, we actually made it bigger, but we gave it a better or a greater purpose, and we made time for it.
I love that idea. Absolutely love that. It's so nice. And I don't know why, well, I'm sure somebody probably has thought of it, Catherine, before, but I've never heard of that. And I think it's just a very simple switch, actually, in terms of the approach to reporting that clearly has had, from your experience, a really impactful
Yeah.
change in your school and your school culture as well. Co-writing reports, I love that. And I think as well that, getting the tutors involved is vital. Tutor time from experience can be reduced and reduced and reduced over a period of years, because obviously the goalposts for curriculum and for, as you said, particularly working in the private sector, for results driven schools and teaching has kind of overtaken, unfortunately, in a lot of schools, I feel. But never underestimate the power of the tutor and that pastoral connection as well. And I think you hit the nail on the head there with the co-writing of reports and the tracking conversations. Did it work as effectively, just out of interest, Catherine, with those, because obviously you said you trialled it, which I would imagine is a good move, with the year 13s first, but did it work as effectively with lower down? Do you
Yeah,
think they had the
it did
maturity, or?
actually. They did actually. They took it really seriously, and which was a lovely surprise. We weren't sure that it would have that effect lower down, but we at the same time we rewrote our report sort of language, so the semantics of the reporting progress we changed, and again we did that ourselves, and then we took it to the students and took their feedback, and what we wanted was for them to be able to recognise themselves in that language, so that if then on the report it used a specific descriptor for a certain type of behaviour, we wanted them to go, oh yeah, that is me, that is what I do. And we wanted to describe learning behaviours in that reporting system. So because we were trying to shift, I suppose, the students from being a little bit passive in their learning, that they were sort of there, kind of open-mouthed, waiting for these teachers to kind of divulge learning on them. And we wanted them to become much more active participants in that. So to shift their behaviours, we needed to make sure that they recognised what we were describing in the reports. But it took 2 or 3 years to embed that and for them to understand. But I remember an assembly that we did by the time we got down to year 7, where we asked them we put up a word and we asked them to tell us what they thought that would look like in the classroom, and they nailed it. So I think we probably over worried that the younger students wouldn't be able to recognise what we were aiming for.
Amazing. That sounds awesome. And I think as well, parents' evenings and reports, very cliche, and this is a generalization here, guys, but I know for me, it can seem such a drag and such a burden in the lead up to these events, because you know how much of your time you're going to spend writing these reports, and it becomes so mundane in a way. And the same for parents' evenings, but actually they're so powerful in terms of connecting with parents and addressing students' needs, and giving that positive feedback and reinforcement that can make the difference between a child not learning in your lesson and a child learning and becoming the best that they can be. And what I think sometimes in sort of the midst of it all, we see as, it's going to take lots of time and pointless administrative tasks. Actually, as you say, if we sit back and think about the purpose and the reason why perhaps leaders are asking us, or departments of education are asking us to do these, they are for 9 times out of 10, not always, 9 times out of 10, for a really genuine purpose that's going to impact the teaching and learning in the classroom. So yeah, it's an interesting point. I really, really like that idea though, Catherine. Thanks for sharing that with us. I did a quick social media poll yesterday, actually, and just put on which type of non-teaching admin tasks take up most of your time, just out of interest for the educators out there. And interesting results came in this morning, which were the least amount of time. Colleagues had said data entry and assessment as well, which was interesting. And the most amount of time, at 35% of those asked, was spent on meetings and admin tasks. And I think we've delved certainly into the admin task being a hugely broad category. So that was interesting. And again, I think it boils down to what you were saying, Catherine and Manny, about making it purposeful and having that support and time put aside so that teachers feel they can share the expertise, that they are supported, and that there's real relevance and impact directly back into the classroom and to their students and their teaching and learning. Right, Manny, I hope you're still there with us. I'm going to ask you a question now regarding, this is actually moving on a little bit into the impact of increased student needs then in school, which, as we're all aware of educators, is continuing to increase. And of course, that has to have a direct impact on teacher workload. And of course, it does. So, Manny, what or do you feel, again, I use social media to share a Guardian article that came up last week, I think it was. Teachers regularly helping pupils in distress in attempt to fill NHS funding gap. And this article was talking, shockingly, that 3 in 4 teachers put a pupil's psychological needs before teaching at least once a week. And I say shockingly, it's not. As a teacher, I completely see how this can happen. But this was a UK survey done recently. So, Manny, psychological needs and increasing social, emotional, mental health, and of course our special educational needs amongst our students are ever increasing and are ever diverse. So do you feel, as an inclusion specialist, that teachers are picking up the pieces of this deepening crisis in children and young people's needs?
Yes, I will say that. I mean, right now in the UAE, the educational landscape is very different. So if I go back into time and think about my last position in the UK as an assistant head, I was head of safeguarding, head of inclusion, and also head of behavior. And one of the things that we struggled with was the amount of needs that the children who were recently coming into the school had, but also the capacity for our teachers to be able to support them. And it boiled down to one thing, essentially. In the past, we used to criticize teachers for not being able to identify children who had needs. We'd put a lot of work into making sure that the members of staff in the classroom were welcoming towards the children when they came in, that they were present, that they would ask them how their day was, that they would look out for signs. We did a lot of work on safeguarding and abuse and what that could possibly look like, etc., especially in the communities that we were working in. And so I think the most disappointing thing was that when teachers were actually identifying these needs and they were seeing families struggling, the school would go through the natural process of working with the local authority, and we would find that CAMS, who were the organization, the partners that we worked with to be able to support children with these needs, they weren't available. And I don't believe it was CAM's fault. I think they are incredibly understaffed, under-resourced. And so what we would find in a number of local authorities is that although we were referring children and we were putting in interventions in the school, CAMS just didn't have the capacity to be able to support these children. So then it would come back to the school, and we would find teachers having to do things that maybe they wouldn't typically do, like doing home visits with the SENCO, with the head of inclusion like myself. Staff members would have to start thinking about the child's meal at the start of the day, because if the child's come into school and they haven't had their meal, their first meal of the day, or they're not sure if they're going to have their second meal of the day, these are the things that they're now having to think about rather than the teaching and the learning that's taking place. So I do think teachers are in a very difficult position, depending on where they are in the UK. I always referenced the Scandinavian countries. Is something I would love to do in the future, which is to go and visit there. But I've done a lot of reading about how things are done in certain countries in the Scandinavian region, and teachers are actually given time to be able to do what they call social work, essentially, to have time to be able to call families, have time to check up on children, have mentoring sessions, have one-to-one, speak to the families. And I always say that our roles as teachers is always evolving, but one of the things that hasn't changed is that we are, to many children, second parents, to many of them mentors, many of them an advocate. And so our role is very complex, and it's incredibly important for even just one child. You being there consistently, you being there to ask them how they are, you being there to identify a need, you being there to liaise with their parents. These are incredibly important things, not just the teaching itself. And so I think if teachers first and foremost aren't equipped, and they don't have the capacity to do this on top of all of the other admin tasks that they have to do, we are probably seeing the result of no solution, which is a teacher crisis as well as a student crisis. We are seeing many teachers leave the profession, or at least leave to go to neighboring countries or countries across the world where maybe these things are catered for. So I do think we are suffering in the UK. I say we because although I'm abroad at the moment, the UK is still very dear to me, and I still work and consult with a lot of schools who are struggling with these particular things.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking, and you feel, I'm sure, Manny, like a lot of other educators as well, not just in the UK, I think in other countries as well, but certainly in the UK, like you're banging your head against a brick wall. And I know it was just making me think then we went back to the UK. Myself and my husband are from Derbyshire originally, and we went back over half term, and we went for a lovely country walk, and it was great in the countryside, fresh air, which of course we're not used to in the desert here in Abu Dhabi. And I was walking with my best friend who's been a primary teacher for years and years and years. She's highly skilled, very experienced, very passionate, puts all the hours in under the sun. And I said to her, don't you fancy being a Senko, taking on a Senko role now? And her words were pretty much, Manny, what you've just said, that as much as she can see the needs increasing in her school that she works in and across the board, she just would find it too frustrating that, even if we identify that a student has these needs, it's almost like there's nowhere to go after that. And I think this is the crisis that a lot of schools are facing. And as you said, Manny, it's no individual authority's fault at all. We're not putting blame on anybody, but this in turn is adding frustration, stress and workload to teachers as well as the students themselves. So I think you hit the nail on the head there with it's a student and teacher crisis that we're facing as well. We've got a couple of questions, so I'm just going to pause if that's okay with you. We've got one for Catherine, which is just going back, Catherine, to what we were discussing before, if this is okay, from one of our listeners. And it says, how often, when you were talking about this wonderful idea of the tracking conversations that you implemented in your school, how often would this type of reporting happen?
So I'm going back quite a few years now, so I'm just trying to think. I think that we largely oriented those conversations around the three main reporting moments in the year. So every year group would have a parents' evening, what we called in our context a longer report, so a sort of decent paragraph of feedback, and then what we called a short report. So essentially each of those happened once a term. In the exam years, year 11 and year 13 in my case, there were also when we had mocks, etc., there were also moments there where we would reflect on the results, but essentially 3 times a year for most year groups.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you very much. And I would encourage our listeners, thank you again for tuning in this evening, this afternoon, depending on where you are, to please do keep posting your questions or even call in live to the show. Manny and Catherine will be very honoured, I'm sure, to answer your questions. We've got another one from John Cooper here. So this is to both Manny and Catherine. Is there a link between increasingly outdated curricula with a perceived teacher workload issue and an upsurge in student wellbeing needs? I mean, my next question was going to be very similar to that in terms of sort of our policies outdated, and is it the responsibility of leaders in schools to be updating the policies to meet the needs of the the inclusion, the growing inclusion needs that our students have, or is it the teacher's responsibility, or is it the inclusion team, or is it a whole team effort, was going to be sort of my take on it. So do we think that our schools, our policies, our curricula is outdated in terms of Manny, the needs that you're seeing in the UK that you've experienced internationally?
Okay, so I'm going to try my best to answer this, but in order for me to answer it, I actually want to um, I just want to present what things look like in the UK compared to what they look like now, and then hopefully that might be able to pull out an answer. So in the UK, of course, I taught in British schools, so I taught the British curriculum, and I guess my main critique is that I thought much of our curricula was outdated. I didn't see it as a purposeful curriculum for the most part. And of course, I saw many young people who struggled to access the curriculum. And actually, we tried to fit them into the current curriculum rather than thinking about not just personalizing the needs, because that's also a buzzword, but just making sure that the education for every child is purposeful. And in that way, we can be a bit more inclusive. So I say that to start off because I then moved to the UAE and I joined a school that provides an IB curriculum. And I would say that one of the positives about joining a school that provides an IB curriculum is that one, it promotes student agency. Secondly, it allows children to, it gives children opportunities to explore and to discover, a bit like how we do in the early years. And I think we do that very well in the UK. And so what I found is there's a lot more opportunity for teachers to go on a journey with the children. And in that process of going on a journey, and obviously we don't have the time maybe to go into specifics, but there's a lot more project-based learning. There's a lot more research. There's a lot more student agency. There's a lot more provocations, and children go out and explore and extract themes and lines of inquiry. And so when you think about that, you're giving the teacher and the children an opportunity to go on a journey, and that then impacts the level of assessment. Assessment still takes place, but there's far more intentional questioning. It's not as robust or as rigid as it may be in the British curriculum, where you might have a specific amount of talk time, then you have independent activity time, then you have a plenary, then you have an assessment. And so, from my experience, just working in both types of curriculums, I would say that certainly in the IB curriculum, of course, in the context of my school, because it's not the same everywhere, I do feel like teacher workload is slightly decreased in that sense, just because of the way that they're able to plan for these lessons, how they perform their assessments during the lessons, and also how they record the learning of the children during the 6 to 7 weeks when they're exploring a particular concept.
That's a great answer. Thank you, Manny. That was really insightful. Yeah. And interesting. I've never taught the IB, but that's an interesting comparison between the two curricula as well. I think, because I've only ever taught the British curriculum, that, this is set in stone. We've got a certain amount of wiggle room with it as teachers to personalise it. But interesting to see, of course, that there are other models of learning and of curricula out there as well that perhaps, as you said, are more suited to the vast needs in our classrooms. Catherine, was there anything you wanted to add to that before I
Yes, yeah. I mean, first of all, Manny, I think your last two answers, I think you've expressed so many things so beautifully, and thank you for doing so. I think I was scribbling words down, Manny, when you're answering that last question, and I wrote down purpose, exploration, intention, and agency. And I have also never taught outside the British curriculum. I would love to, and I've long had a yearning to do so, because everything that I see and have experienced within the British system, and it's nobody's fault, it is the way that it is, doesn't naturally include those words. There is a distinct lack of choice and agency, either on the part of the students or the staff. I think that they are funneled rather than exploring, and I think that they are... a lot of people, the frustration comes because they don't know what the intention is, they don't know what the purpose is. And I think systems, which are not gimmicks like project-based learning, they are rigorous and robust methodologies, have so much of value to bring to this space. I also think, and Manny touched on it again, that what our colleagues in the early years space are doing is, I think, outstanding in terms of what an education should be and should look like. And I have formed and deepened a view over the years as a secondary trained teacher, but working in two schools that went from, well, in one case 3 to 18, and the other case actually 6 months to 16, that secondary trained teachers would benefit enormously from going and studying what happens in an early years classroom, and the learning that goes on there, the way that it is shaped, the way that it is planned, the collaboration that happens in that space. And it's interesting. I've been spending some time talking to educators who have been brave enough to break out of the system and set up their own schools in the UK. And several things are interesting. One, so far in my explorations, and they are relatively limited, and it's only me doing it, by myself, so my time has been limited. But so far, the people I've spoken to have all been primary trained teachers. They have all now decided to adopt the IB as their guiding methodology. Or they are starting from the early years and working up, and they're adopting the Reggio approach. And what they are all wanting to create is curricula which are all of those things that Manny just described. So explorative, that have agency, that allow choice, that are intentional. So coming back to the question that was actually asked, I think, Manny, you just said a phrase that's really key for me at the end, that I don't think that we shouldn't be assessing things. I don't think that we shouldn't be teaching rigorously. What I am saying is that the system that we have in the British system and in the UK space, which I think is largely what we're talking about here, is, I don't think it is fit for purpose. And I think there are teachers working so hard to try to make it fit, and that there are children who are working so hard trying to fit it. And it's that classic sort of, sorry, it's a cliche, but the square peg and the round hole. And I was trying to come up with a visual image of it earlier, and I was thinking it's a bit like tectonic plates. We've got on one, we've got the current ways of doing things, and on the other, we've got all those needs of young people and their families. And I echo everything that Manny said. I have taught sometimes in my career in schools serving deprived communities, but all of everything that Manny said, I experienced equally in my last school where I was head, which was a non-selective independent school, where often families had sacrificed an awful lot to make a choice to send their child to that school because they felt their needs might be better met in an environment with smaller class sizes, perhaps better resources. They all had their different reasons, but I'm afraid that as educators we ran into exactly the same problems with trying to do that through a system that is just cracking at the seams. So these two tectonic plates, the ways of doing things and the needs of young people and their families, set against a context that is unlike anything that we have experienced in the last 20, 25, 30 years. Our society at the moment is in a really particular moment, which is itself adding a degree of stress and strain, and these two tectonic plates are just pushing up against each other and causing enormous pressure to build in schools. And it's not that nobody wants to make it work, and it's not that people aren't trying, but I don't think the system is allowing them to do what they know that is right and what they need to do. So is the system the problem? Yes.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, both of you sort of echoed what one another said, which was perfect. And also, it made me think a lot about my own experience. And for the first time, I'm secondary trained like you, Catherine. And for the first time working international, I've had to teach down to as low as year 4, which initially was a shock to the system because it's a completely different style, of course, of teaching. But I must say, and I hope my colleagues aren't listening to this, but I must say I really quite enjoy teaching year 4 and 5 because it does feel like a different way of teaching, and the pressure is taken away to a certain degree. And of course, I've still got to report on those students, and I've still got to get them from, location A to location B by the end of the year. But it's just a more holistic, more inclusive, I feel, way of teaching, and way of delivering the curriculum lower down in the primary school that I work in, compared to the senior school. So that is an interesting point that both of you made, and I definitely advocate that. And the other thing I wanted to mention as well, and we are going to take a quick break because we could talk all night, and I knew this would happen when I was planning it, and when I asked my guests to come on, because they're so insightful and wonderful and inspirational, that I knew that we'd have so much to talk about. But I'm going to leave just before the news. I'm going to leave I had a quick look online at whether the Department for Education in the UK actually had anything set in stone out there for a recognition of teacher workloads in terms of policies. And I'm sure leaders will know about this in the UK and in British curriculum schools, but surprisingly, the Department of Education do have a document called Ways to Reduce Workload in Your Schools. It was updated, however, in March 2019, and I just wanted to leave that with you because I think that really echoes what Catherine and Manny was saying, and the great question that we had from John earlier in regards to, and I'm going to steal your visual here, Catherine, the tectonic plates, and how, the increasing needs are continuing, and yet perhaps some of our policies and curricula may not quite be there yet. Okay, we're going to take a quick break now. Grab yourselves a drink. Do keep listening though, because Joe at Teachers Talk Radio always does a fantastic job of delivering the news for us, and we'll catch Manny and Catherine back in a few moments.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at BetUK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at BetUK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
A group representing 1,400 private schools will press ahead with plans for a legal challenge against the government's introduction of VAT from January, according to the BBC. The Independent Schools Council, the body which includes most independent schools in the UK, has voted to pave the way for legal action which will be brought on behalf of parents, including those with children with special educational needs. A Treasury spokesperson told the BBC they do not comment on potential litigation. Chancellor Rachel Reeves confirmed private schools would no longer be exempt from VAT in the autumn budget, but said the money raised would help to provide the highest quality of support and teaching in the state sector. The government has estimated it would raise £460 million extra to spend on state schools next year, rising to £1.7 billion by 2029-30. The ISC is hoping for a judicial review of the government's policy, which will focus around claims of breaches of the European Convention on Human Rights, specifically Article 14, the prohibition of discrimination, and Article 2, the right to education. The ISC says its legal claimants will be parents who argue they cannot find an alternative education for their children in the state sector, and are likely to include families with children with special educational needs. In an impact assessment, the government confirmed that only those children with a local authority EHCP with a private school named on it will be exempt from the VAT policy. The Guardian reports on plans by some UK schools to boost maternity pay to stem the numbers of female teachers in their 30s leaving the profession. Head teachers and charities, according to the article, are warning that more than 9,000 women aged between 30 and 39 left state education last year, and that government will not fix teacher shortages unless it acts to stop experienced women leaving. Experts say alongside a standard maternity pay package for teachers that lags behind many other employers, excessive workload and guilt about not having time for their own children are leading women in this age group to conclude that motherhood is not compatible with teaching. Now, an academy trust which runs schools in Hull and the East Riding of Yorkshire is planning to help, with the CEO saying nobody should have to choose between being seen as a good teacher or a good mum and dad. The trust now approves 98% of all requests for flexible working and has a policy that everyone must be able to attend their own children's sports days and school plays. The trust is also diverging from most of the sector, where teachers get 4 weeks maternity leave at full pay, 2 weeks at 90%, then 12 weeks on half pay. Instead, they'll offer from day one 18 weeks on full pay and 8 on half pay for teachers and support staff. They will also offer uncapped paid leave for women who suffer a miscarriage. Other academy trusts have also enhanced maternity packages. The Department for Education said recruiting and keeping great teachers in our classrooms is vital to improving life chances for all children. We are committed to resetting the relationship with the education workforce and working alongside them to re-establish teaching as an attractive, expert profession. The BBC in Scotland reports that a council looks set to drop plans to switch to a 4.5-day school week following consultation. The local authority in Dumfries and Galloway was considering the move to develop and enhance education provision in the region. However, the majority of parents who took part in their survey were against the plans. A council report has recommended maintaining the current school week structure in the face of the feedback. The move was being considered as part of plans to modernise teaching provision, but the early Friday finish was described as yet another headache for families by the union Unison. The findings of the consultation will be taken to an Education Committee meeting on the 8th of November. School staff views were split over the plans, with more in favour than against, but more than a quarter remained unsure. Pupils backed the plans, although a significant number were undecided. Finally, the Department for Education has said it will end its grant scheme for schools choosing to be an academy at the end of this year, and has no plans to continue to run its trust capacity and trust establishment and growth funds. According to the report in Schools Week, trusts waiting to hear about capacity and growth funding bids for this summer's funding round have also been told no cash will be handed out. The government's upcoming Children's Wellbeing Bill will seek to bring the two parts of the sector closer together, requiring academies to follow the national curriculum and cooperate with councils on admissions and pupil place planning. The Confederation of School Trusts said the decisions would make it much more difficult for trusts to support maintained schools that need help. Further details of the story can be found on the Schools Week website. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Jo Fox.
Thank you so much, Jo, as always, for the news there on Teachers Talk Radio. And we are back live at the Sunday Twilight Show with myself, Sarah Kate Tolson. So just to recap then, we are talking tonight. And I think if you were just listening to the news there, it really is, and we said at the start of the show, but a poignant, relevant and hot topic right now. We're discussing the reduction potentially of administrative tasks to create better teacher-student connections in our schools and educational workplaces. We're joined tonight or this afternoon by Manny and by Catherine, our specialists, and they've been giving some wonderful insights into various different subtopics, which has been great. We've looked at a variety of things so far, from amending curricula to supporting our students' needs, which are of course ever increasing, to supporting our staff through CPD and collaborative planning sessions, and to perhaps looking at the purpose of the tasks that we're asking our staff to do and ensuring that they are relevant and impactful to the teaching and learning in our classrooms, to mention merely a few of the wonderful topics that we have covered so far. So for the final part of the show then, we've still got loads in front of me that I wanted to ask Catherine and Manny, but I'm going to try and select just a few for us for the last few minutes of the show. So I wanted to start off the second half then, Catherine and Manny, with burnout. So teacher burnout is a phrase that we're seeing a lot in the press, on social media, amongst our teaching and educational communities and colleagues at the moment. So I wanted to find out, actually, the geek in me, what is the definition of burnout? So the definition of burnout is a syndrome caused by chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. And that is according to the World Health Organization. So I think we all relate burnout to stress. I think that's quite an obvious one. But the interesting part in that definition for me really was that stress that has not been successfully managed. So my first topic of conversation then, following the news to my guest then, is who is responsible for managing this increased workload and stress?
So I'll start if that's okay.
I thought you both at the toilet still or making a cup of tea, but you're both here.
No, I'm here. So thank you, Sarah. So I think that at the end of the day, responsibility for your well-being does start with the self. That doesn't mean that there aren't things that organisationally can be done, but I think it does start with personal responsibility, and I'm really glad that you framed the question in that way. Teachers, perhaps by nature, are often perfectionists and are acutely aware that they are responsible day in, day out. As Manny said earlier, we're like second parents, and sometimes can become quite literally somebody's family. You know, you're the person that shows up for those children day in, day out, and that is a huge responsibility. Many teachers will have other caring responsibilities. They may be married, they may have children, they may have elderly relatives or other relatives who they care for, or friends or neighbours. And in the middle of all of that is themselves. So it starts with being kind to ourselves and taking responsibility for that. Now, it's a little bit pot kettle here when I'm talking, because, you know, I'm not necessarily the best at always taking my own advice in this respect. But I think calling out that perfectionism. So, you know, let's imagine that you're in charge of a sports team, you know, or some sports teams. You know, you get them ready for a competition and you practice all the hours that you think are reasonable that you can, and then your team don't win. And it can be really hard to be, you know, really easy, sorry, to be really hard on yourselves as a consequence of that. And I think it's about reframing an opportunity. So saying, okay, they didn't win, and you might feel disappointed, and you might not get that moment in assembly where, you know, that win could be celebrated. But did they turn up? Yes. Did they play as hard as they could? Yes. Did they represent the school proudly? Yes. And did they lose with respect for the other side? Yes. Well, then that is an amazing achievement and testament to what you've done. And you could replicate that set of criteria across any number of scenarios. So being okay with something being good enough is really important. And then and that starts with you as an individual, being okay with it being good enough. You know, it cannot always be perfect. Different example, I taught English. I'm a secondary English trained teacher. If I looked across my scope of lessons for the week, and if I had a day when I was teaching all day, I would think, okay, I can stand on that, as it were, that stage in that classroom, and I can absolutely deliver, you know, the best lessons I think I can. I can spend hours and hours preparing them. Or I can cut myself some slack in the middle of that day, and I can have a lesson where I expect the students to be doing some research, or actually reading for 10-15 minutes in that lesson, just to find myself a moment, a space in that day where I can just stop and take a breath, and organise my thoughts, because that's often what you don't get the space to do in the context of a school day. You barely get the time to go to the toilet, frankly, half the time. So again, not trying to do everything to the absolute, best that that you could, but doing it so that it's good enough. And then if you think about then the leadership of the school, and leadership comes at many different levels. So whether you're a head of year, a head of department, some kind of team lead, or whether you are the deputy head or the head, it's also about modelling that. So modelling that and giving people permission for something to be good enough. And I think it's really important that we choose the language that we use in schools really carefully, and so that we actually articulate that. Or to give another example, I have fairly young children. So when I was the head, I didn't sneak out quietly when I needed to leave to do something for my children. I made sure that people knew if I was leaving at that time, because I had to take them and do something for them. And I think as leaders, you have a real responsibility and a privilege to model a healthy work-life balance. So letting yourself be okay with it being good enough, and then if you are in any kind of a leadership role, modeling stopping because you need to give time to the things that are important in your life. I think those are two really important things, I would say.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right with everything that you've said there, Catherine, and it really resonates with me as well. Having worked in middle leadership and being the utmost perfectionist in everything that I do, and really, going on a journey and a realization that it's not okay and it's not good leadership, as you quite rightly say, to expect that of everybody else, because it's impossible. And I certainly have never achieved a work-life balance. Would I say my work-life balance is better now? Yes. Is that because I moved internationally? As Manny said earlier, no, absolutely not. The same challenges are there in the schools, but they're just different challenges, for sure. But I think that modelling from your line leader, from the leaders in the school as well, and your colleagues is absolutely vital as the workload increases, as the individual student needs increase. It really is. And it's just as simple. And you gave some really tangible, really workable strategies there, which is, I think, I'm hoping listeners really want to hear, things that they can start doing tomorrow morning and this week to really reduce that stress, that workload, and that potential burnout, which is what we're addressing tonight. So, and it could be as simple as just making sure that, whenever suits you to send an email is great. And that might be late at night. It might be early on a Sunday morning. It might be after school. But not expecting others to read it at that time. And so we had a policy in our school, which was very, very basic. And I'm sure lots of other schools have now implemented. But it is that you just make sure that you set your email to, send at a particular time and date, which is in the working hours between this time and this time of reasonable hours. Even if you want to write it, don't expect anybody to, to be answering it at that time if it's out of hours. And that, for me, just a small thing, has helped enormously in terms of my leadership and my work-life balance as well. So really great answer to that question. Manny, was there anything that you wanted to add in terms of burnout from a personal level or from student or staff perspective that you've experienced?
Yeah, I think like many of my colleagues, I have experienced burnout almost throughout the whole of my career. I think work-life balance is something I have worked really hard to try and manage. I think if you've got high expectations of yourself, that's a very difficult thing to manage. I always say to my wife, I genuinely don't know how to rest. When I have a half term, for instance, I'm still finding ways to be ready for work, and I don't actually dedicate that time to resetting and to just spend time with family and to do things I might not normally do during the term. I do live by a principle. I call it the SPICE. So I've used this with a lot of NQTs or ECTs that we call now. And so SPICE essentially stands for spiritual, physical, intellectual, creativity, and last one was emotional. And essentially, I try and make sure I do one of those 5 things in the day. So do something that's spiritual. So whether it's meditation, praying, I have a relationship with God, and I try and use the mornings and the evenings and during the day to pray. So that's something that I'm doing each day. Physical, I've got a 15-minute rule, even if it's 10-15 minutes in the morning. At the end of the day, if I can't go to the gym, do something that's physical. Intellectual, so read something, listen to a podcast, have conversations with staff, or your wife or your spouse. Have something that kind of excites you or engages your intellect. And then the second to last one is creativity. So do something that you enjoy. I love to cook. Some people like to paint, some people like to draw, they like to write. And then the last one is emotional, spending time with family, making sure you have an opportunity to be able to express yourself and to just have some downtime with family. So I generally kind of use that as a rule, because I know it's very difficult, whether you're a teacher, middle leader, or senior leader, to just work, and I say this to my staff all the time: the work will always be there. The work never ends. So there is a time that you have to cut off and say, actually, it's time to go to bed. I need to reset and start again. But I'm also aware that, unfortunately, the education system has become a very toxic environment for many staff members. And I have experienced that personally. And it isn't helpful when you are receiving messages at 9:30 in the evening, about something that needs to be presented in the morning, or something that you have to do. I do know what it feels like to feel like, despite the fact you've worked from a certain hour in the morning to a certain hour in the evening, you have deadlines, you've got things that you have to do. So this is me speaking to myself. I would say, especially for any young members of staff, or young educators that have just got into the profession, be honest and be transparent. I think if you're in a workplace where you can't speak to your line manager, or at least someone in a senior position, about your circumstance, about what you could do, what they could do to help you to manage your work-life balance, then I think that's quite a toxic environment and quite a toxic place. And I think if you can identify that from the beginning, I would say maybe have a look and see if maybe there's the potential for you to go somewhere else. I do say that one person can have a bad experience in a school, and it causes them to doubt whether they're a good teacher or not, but they could go to another school and they could be flying, because it could be the culture, it could be the policy. So there are many things, although I do think it's the responsibility of the individual to manage their own burnout and to manage their own work-life balance. I think the school, of course, as we know, as any institution, will have that responsibility. They do play a part in our capacity to rest, to manage our burnout. So I think it is twofold, but we have the power, essentially.
So true, Manny. Both of those, and the 2 points that you make there. The responsibility, as Catherine said, is ultimately and first and foremost has to be your own. It is your responsibility to manage that. But as we know, as passionate educators, and we all are, and I started off the show saying how amazed I am at the extra hours we voluntarily put in as educators, whether it's a conference, a CPD, a podcast, whatever it might be. And we're doing that off our own bat. We're not doing it 99% of the time because our senior leaders are telling us to do so. We're doing that because we want to better ourselves, because we are continuously wanting to improve our practice, and because we are perfectionists and we want the best for our students. But it's tough, as you've both said, it really is tough to maintain that. And when your timetable is increasing and your student needs are increasing and your time to upskill yourself on those needs and that specification that's just come out and the new curriculum or whatever it might be is less and less, it can be hugely overwhelming. And this isn't something that, as we know, a couple of teachers out there are experiencing now. This is real, and this is for the vast majority of educators. And I do want to stress that it is not just teachers as well. How many headlines have we seen recently about senior leaders and the pressure that they're on as well? And, I think it's very quick as a classroom teacher to point your fingers and blame, almost as a blame culture. But, your senior leaders, your governors, your, managers and directors of schools are all under the same amount of pressure here as well. And as we've quite rightly said this evening, that there's no one quick fix, unfortunately. There's a lot to take into account. I just wanted to mention as well the transparency and the trust money that you were talking about. And Catherine, you've adhered to this earlier in the show as well, and this idea of the culture. And it does seem to be a buzzword in education at the moment, but it's always been there as far as I'm concerned. And it is how it makes you feel being in that environment, how a person makes you feel giving that comment or that feedback. And at the end of the day, we're all human beings. And I always say, we teach and preach and we encourage our students to look after their well-being. And I absolutely love that acronym, by the way. I am a huge acronym fan, Manny. So I wrote it down as you were saying it. I'm taking the SPICE acronym with me. And I'm going to really try and do that because it sounds absolutely wonderful. But again, that is something that I would take to my Year 10 tutor group on Wellbeing Wednesday this week and really encourage them to do. So essentially, what we are teaching our students in terms of this holistic curriculum, oracy skills, we're talking about, work-life balance, we're talking about transparency, trust. It's everything that we want as educators and as colleagues as well, isn't it? A good book recommendation I will get in here is Grace Beverley's Working Hard, Hardly Working. If you've not read it, it really is quite good. And I just scribbled down a quote from that I thought would be quite relevant, and it is here, is that we need to move away, and she is a non-teacher, by the way, but we need to move away from goal-orientated purpose and towards what she calls actualization, and that's how to make our work for us and find happiness in the process, whilst acknowledging that at the end of the day, as much as we're passionate educators, how many of us wake up in the morning and go, oh, I can't wait to get to work today? It is work, it is a job, but it's taking those small wins, as Catherine was saying. It's doing that one great lesson a day, or it's having that time to take and really use your time, the SPICE acronym I'll go back to, Manny, for yourself, to make sure that you are the best person you can be for those young people in front of you as well. And that's so important. We talk about regulating, our students being self-regulated, but our staff need to be as well. Right, the time has come and we could talk all night. We've got 10 minutes left, guys. So we're going to finish the show tonight with some adverts, and then I'm going to do a final close. We've covered so much and more, which I'm delighted about, and I'm sure that our listeners are too. Somebody's commented on Manny's SPICE acronym as well, is great. I think we're all going to be practicing this week. So we'll give you the feedback, Manny, to see whether it works. Something we haven't talked too much about, and I know we've not got a great amount of time, but this is something that is huge at the moment. We can't go onto social media or into school without talking about AI. Just very quickly, my sort of penultimate question to you both is role of technology. Would you say, from experience, talking about the topic tonight in terms of teacher-student connections and lessening those admin tasks, would you say it's a help or a hindrance to educators?
I'll go first on this one. I don't mind. I wouldn't say it's a hindrance. I mean, from my personal experience, and also the feedback that I get from colleagues, I think it has helped to reduce teacher workload massively. And if I'm going to give specific examples, just being able to put in instructions. So we have programs, for instance, like Magic School. Of course, people can use ChatGPT, but you can put in an instruction on Magic School and it will provide you a stimulus or a provocation based on the topic that you want to cover in the lesson. You could put in, for instance, ideas for a lesson plan, and it would give you an outline. I always say to both the teachers and to the students, it's not there to do your work, it's there to help you it's there to help you essentially, but it's not there to replace the work that you would do anyway. So if people are using artificial intelligence, they just have to be mindful that you are still the creative hub. You still have responsibility over that piece of work, and if you use it to aid what you're doing, then there's no harm in that at all.
Can I just ask a question as well, Manny? And I completely agree with you. And I think in the international context of a private school that I'm in, I was having this discussion with my husband earlier. I don't know what I would do, which sounds ridiculous, doesn't it, without iPads in my classroom now, in terms of adapting the teaching and learning, in terms of meeting the needs, particularly of my EAL students and the amount of needs I have in one particular mixed ability class. And that just seems ridiculous, because if you'd have said to me 5 years ago, working in, a maintained school in the UK, I could only teach when a student has an iPad, or I could only meet the needs of a student with an iPad, I would have laughed in your face. So the next question I just want to ask on the back of that, Manny, is do you think that technology in the UK or internationally could widen the socio-economic gaps in education as much as it is a help in terms of workload?
Short answer, because of time, I would say yes, it can. Quite simply because the direction that we're going in at the moment, artificial intelligence, technology, it's here to stay, and it is the future. So I think we have a big problem if, one, we're not preparing young people for the world that we've already transitioned into. But secondly, the jobs, the careers, the new roles that are literally being created day by day. These roles, at the center of them is knowledge and wisdom and understanding and practice of using technology, using programs, being able to code, being able to use artificial intelligence, being able to use apps to create. Some schools now have within their curriculum being able to use programs like Canva, and we have certain adults that don't know how to use that, but Canva is the way in which most people are creating presentations, YouTube, Reels. So I think when you consider that, and then you then have schools in deprived parts of London, for instance, where I used to work. And, I've witnessed schools where they have 30 laptops for a whole primary school to be able to share. And so I don't think a genius needs to work out that if those young people aren't getting the time to be able to practice, to utilize those skills, even if it's not to the same extent as other children, but if they're not practicing at all, if they're not even aware of the tools and the skills that they could be developing, then they are going to fall behind. And that's not what we want. We want equity. And that's not going to be the case when both 16-year-olds, one that's had that experience using technology and one that's not had it at all, they're not starting at the same starting place, and I think that will affect people's ability to work and to be creative and to be business people, entrepreneurs, etc. So I do think it has a part to play.
Yeah, a direct impact. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Thank you, Manny, for that. Another really insightful answer. My final question then to Catherine, the wonderful Manny, who've given up their time tonight. I'm so grateful. Honestly, your answers have been better than I ever expected, and I'm sure our audience thinks the same as well. It's been such a great conversation tonight. My final question then for our listeners out there is, if you could give one top tip from your experience as educators of how to create the best teacher-student connection you possibly can, what one top tip would you suggest to our educators to create that real positive teacher-student connection?
So I think for me, it's not tangible, but you have to trust your staff. You have to distribute leadership, and you have to allow agency. I think the days of top-down didactic, managerialism are over. Society doesn't expect that anymore. It doesn't work that way anymore. I think trust your staff, give them the space to know their students, and let them do their job.
Amazing. Thank you, Catherine. Over to you, Manny, for the final words.
Yes. Could you just repeat that question just so I can?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you were to give one top tip or recommendation to educators out there in terms of a positive teacher-student connection, what would it be? So Catherine's talked about the trust within the workplace.
How do you narrow it down to one thing? I mean, I don't know how cliche it sounds, or cringe even, but I think just remembering that every young person that comes into the room is a human being, and every single one of us require connection. It's what makes things work. And so I think even taking the time to ask one of your students or a child how you are, how was your weekend, showing some kind of interest in them could make the world of difference. And I think if you were to do that every single day, irrespective of where that child is in their learning or in their progress or in their attainment, a child that feels welcomed, a child that feels seen, a child that feels or experiences being acknowledged, I think that for them will go a long way. I see it as you planting a seed. So even if you don't see the fruits of that in your particular class or in your particular year, I think if every single staff member showed that level of care and empathy to each child when they saw them, just from a human point of view, that child undoubtedly at the end of their school experience will probably go away and be a lot more wholesome in their development.
Definitely. What a lovely way to end the show. And I think that works in the same way for staff as well, doesn't it? The power of a smile and a good morning, regardless of the timetable and the workload pressures that you've got for that day. So thank you once again to listeners for your support, for your questions, for your input this evening on the show. Manny has put in the chat another really good book recommendation, which I'll certainly be adding to my Amazon wish list for the winter break. So thanks so much, Manny, for that. Thank you to our special guests once again for being so wonderful, so experienced and so insightful in everything that they've answered tonight. And we have done a world tour, I think, of every subtopic we could possibly address tonight. So hopefully we've given you a really good overview of their experience and given you some top tips to take away as well. So I'm going to end tonight with a quick advert break just before the finale, and I just want to use this opportunity again to thank the wonderful Manny and Catherine, and hope to be in touch, guys. Have a wonderful rest of your evening and a wonderful week back at work.
Thank you, Sarah, very much indeed.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at BetUK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at BetUK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
So as we come to the end of tonight's show, Clear the Path, Fewer Admin Tasks, Better Teacher-Student Connections, let's reflect on what we've uncovered. The message is clear: to elevate teaching and learning and to really encourage teacher-student connection, we must cut through the noise of unnecessary administrative burdens, streamline and refocus on what truly matters: the human connections, the relationships, the moments, the trust, the culture that transform our classrooms. Education thrives when teachers have the time, the space and energy to connect meaningfully with their students. By prioritising impactful quality tasks and letting go of those that drain without gain, we carve out a path for deeper connections, improved student inclusion and much better teacher well-being. I really hope that together we can reinvest our time into what makes teaching powerful and not be too hard on ourselves. We can clear the path, we can make education a profession where teachers don't just survive, but thrive. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Keep inspiring, keep connecting, and most importantly, keep believing in the power of teaching and the impact we make day in, day out. Join me for the last show of 2024 in December. Thanks, guys. Have a good evening.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.